Are Europe and Islam compatible? The way that Islam is often talked about is slightly alarming. When we frame a question such as this, whether Islam and Europe are compatible, we automatically other Islam. There is a sense that the religion and Europe are diametrically opposing forces. Another issue with the question is that it treats the millions of Muslims in the continent as a monolithic bloc. This ignores the many class and ethnic disparities between them. So let us deconstruct the question further. The most obvious point to make is that Islam is not new to Europe. It's been around for almost as long as the religion itself, with the introduction of Islam to Europe occurring in the 8th century into Spain and Portugal. In fact, that was a very productive time for the region, with a lot of prosperity in science and industry. However, the topic is more conceptual than historical, so can it be said that Islam as an ideology has a place in Europe? To that I would say, which Islam? There are 50 million Muslims in Europe and 20 million in the EU itself. All of them would have a very different concept and idea of what Islam is, how they practice it, and how it fits into the framework of Europe. I would also add at this juncture that if Islam and Europe were truly incompatible, as many would have you believe, then the problem of having 50 million adherents to that incompatible faith would be rather inconvenient, and slightly more palpable than as is present. Regardless, there is a lot of misconception about Muslims and their apparent nefarious contribution to the continent. The most basic misconception is that of the magnitude of the Muslim population itself. In France, when polled about what they perceived the population of Muslims to be, respondents said 35%, when the actual figure is around 7%. Similarly, in the UK, when people were asked, they responded 15%. The actual figure is closer to 4%. This can be for two main reasons, the first of which is the media. It often treats stories relating to Muslims as primarily Islamic. Second of all, politicians have used rhetoric which seems to magnify the force and the ambitions of Muslims to an extent where people are scared, and that fear has probably amplified the perception of the number of Muslims within their neighborhood or their communities. But magnitude is only the primary layer. The secondary layer to the uneasiness surrounding the presence of Muslims is a fear that their presence will somehow be a negative for the societies that they enter. It is interesting to see how all discourse seems to portray Muslims as an alien force, when not only are there several Muslim countries within Europe, e.g. Bosnia and Albania, but within Western Europe there are many second-generation, third-generation Muslims who have only really known the UK, France, Germany. Are we still meant to treat them as migrants? And if so, what is the threshold for Britishness or Frenchness? Europe is a continent that is undergoing a huge transition. Its former imperial glory is receding beyond lifetime memory, and its global influence is firmly in decline. And along with the symptoms of that recession is a yearning to preserve identity and to protect it from any perceived threats or external threats. Now, the easiest way to define that identity is by race or religion. And so it's very easy for individuals who want to do so to frame this as a clash of civilisations between Islam and Europe. This fear is something that a lot of politicians have tapped into, for cheap currency, as it is easy to galvanize support around a common enemy. However, do the statistics add up? In the UK, where a lot of such research is done, 83% of Muslims consider themselves to be proud Britons. This is compared to 79% of the general public. 87% of Muslims believe they belong in Britain, whereas only 63% of non-Muslim Britons do so. And in terms of contribution, Muslims are also the most philanthropic amongst the communities in which they live. So this label of otherness is clearly not originating from Muslims. Where does it come from? Politicians have been able to stoke irrational fears of a tumultuous shift in the status quo because of the continental decline that I mentioned earlier. Now they frame a fear that can buy votes. However, where they are most successful is where there are the lowest number of migrants. In fact, UKIP's primary constituencies tend to be where the number of migrants are at their lowest. There seems to be a positive correlation between people having a positive image of Islam and having an exposure to Islam. So the more Muslims you meet, the more likely you are to have a positive image of Islam. Now that is very interesting. I fear that many people will not have that exposure because the situation is rapidly deteriorating, with hate crimes increasing across the continent. In London, a metropolitan city with a Muslim mayor, the number of hate crimes jumped from 3 a day to 20 a day. And in Poland, 44% of Poles have an unfavorable opinion of Muslims. Some listeners of this podcast may allude to the fact that I haven't yet mentioned any terrorist attacks. And perhaps if I had mentioned them, then the link between these xenophobic attitudes and the link between them and Muslims becomes stronger and clearer. However, it is very important to address this head-on. Most Muslims view these terrorist attacks as completely alien to their beliefs, in fact probably as alien as a Christian or a Jew would. When we chastise the many refugees for crossing the Mediterranean and trying to seek refuge within this continent, we have to remember that their fear of ISIS is as real as ours, and probably graver because they've seen the realities of living under that system. This rhetoric of hate has to stop. It simply does not add up, and these xenophobic opinions peddled by the far right are simply not fact-based. We have to embrace our differences, but realize that our commonality is enormous. There is nothing exceptional about Islam as a world religion. It has its failings and its glories just the same as other religions. The fact that politicians are able to convince large swathes of the population that Muslims are out to completely reform the societies in which they live is preposterous. Many Muslims have voluntarily come to these countries and have sought opportunities that they wouldn't be afforded within their own. So any idea that they would want to jeopardize their status quo or the opportunities that they have is preposterous. Muslims have the same ambitions, they have the same fears, they have the same hopes as everyone else. And it is time our rhetoric reflects that. And the media has to start being more responsible, and politicians have to find another way to galvanize votes than simply the mindless, baseless, and cheap fear that they are currently doing.